Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our League of Women Voters of Massachusetts webinar. My name is Karen Price, and I co-chair with Lana Zamaro the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts Steering Committee for Environmental Action and Advocacy. This webinar is part of our Climate and Energy Solutions series. This is our second webinar using Zoom, so we are still a little bit rusty. Well, not rusty, we're still getting used to it. Please bear with us. Three of us, Lana, our speaker, David Ismay, and I are the hosts, and we are able to speak and be heard. David will be speaking most of the time. His slides will be displayed along with a small box of him speaking, which you should see now. You can drag that small box up to the upper right of your corner or wherever you want so it does not interfere with the slides. Your controls are in a black bar at the bottom of the screen. Move your mouse arrow to the bottom of the screen and raise hand and chat should appear. We will use these later in the question and answer session, and I will go over specific directions then. In the meantime, please don't raise your hand. You can do written chat to us if you need to communicate during the presentation. So let's get started. Our guest speaker is David Ismay, Senior Staff Attorney at the Conservation Law Foundation, Massachusetts. He is the Clean Energy and Climate Change Staff Attorney for the foundation. He has substantial experience in drafting, negotiating, and litigating commercial contracts for public and private entities with focus on major capital construction of buildings, infrastructure, and renewable alternative energy power plants, as well as prosecuting and defending local land use approvals and related environmental review. We are grateful to him for sharing his time, and now we will turn it over to David.
Well, thank you very much, Karen and Lana, and to the League for inviting CLF and me to give this presentation. So what we'll be talking about today is a bill that's filed, and there on the screen you can see it was filed in two places, in the House and also in the Senate, in the Massachusetts legislature at the beginning of this two-year session, which ends in July. And at the time, the Kane case, which is a case that CLF brought to enforce the Global Warming Solutions Act, was fairly recent, and we were looking ahead to what we thought would make the most difference in the near term now to set up success for meeting our mid-century or 2050 goals. The Global Warming Solutions Act, as many of you may know, requires Massachusetts to drastically reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to a level below 80% of 1990 levels by 2050. So we'll be talking about this bill, and let's see. Oh, let me see if I can advance the slides. I apologize there. Let me try this again. There we go. And we think this is a great time to pass this act for a number of reasons. One is that this is the 10th anniversary this year of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So we've been doing a lot over the last 10 years. Massachusetts is a leader, and we think this is the best way for us to continue together, and I'll be talking about that later, that this, I think, maybe just because we're lawyers, I hope not, but this law is really the foundation for how we achieve these goals, do it together, and do it over a sustained 32-year period we have left. That's through many administrations, governorships, speakers of the House and presidents of the Senate. So this is really the foundation that keeps us going. And as I'll talk in a little bit, this is all about implementation. So we know what the goal is. The question is, how do we get to the goal? How do we do it cost effectively? And how can we achieve those goals without harming each other while taking care of low and moderate income folks and others who need and deserve some protection here. So again, I mentioned that this bill was filed in two places. Right now, it is part of S2302. It is section 67 of that 122-page bill. That is a Senate omnibus out of the Global Warming and Climate Change Committee of the Senate, led by Senator Mark Pacheco. It also has significant support in the House, albeit 80 votes is a majority, or 81 votes is a majority in the House. But we have at least 26 active supporters of this bill. We've met with leadership with Patricia Haddad, who's the Speaker Pro Tem of the House, number 2 representative in the House. And its main sponsor in the House was Representative Frank Smisek from Brookline. He's the chair of the House Committee on Global Warming and Climate Change, and was a main author of the original Global Warming Solutions Act. So this is what I'm going to go over today, and we'll have some time for questions for sure. But what's changed since 2008? Why do we need something more than just the Global Warming Solutions Act itself? Why do we need a roadmap? And anyway, what is ISME talking about? What is a roadmap? And then the specifics of what this bill would do. So a lot has changed since 2008. For one, in 2008, we passed the Global Warming Solutions Act essentially on the political assumption in many people's mind that the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill would fly through the democratically controlled Congress and be signed by a new Democratic president, President Obama. And that did not happen. And we find ourselves in different terrain now where there's really zero chance of any concerted federal action to address climate change. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative Coalition, which was New England plus a number of mid-Atlantic states, it really ground to a halt in 2010. Those same midterm elections that killed the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill in DC saw Chris Christie elected in New Jersey and pull New Jersey out of RGGI. It saw Governor LePage elected in Maine, and a group of states that had been working well together on regional issues for the previous 10 years really stopped working together. We also have things we've learned. There's better science, there's a better way to approach this problem, and we're really here, we'd be following the European Union and California, which have been at the forefront of climate planning and climate action. And then the Kane case that I mentioned before, where in some people's minds our goals, the limits in the Kane case were seen as aspirational, and the Supreme Court made it very clear that those are legally enforceable, that this is something we must do. And if we have to do it now, it's not just a nice to have, we really need to figure out how we're going to get there. And that's what a roadmap is about. It's about implementation. It's how do we get to the goal that we've already established. And so some of the things at the bottom of the screen there, the scope of change, the scale of the change. Very importantly, how fast do we move? What's too fast, which normally means costs too much money or costs more than we need? What's too slow, where we're endangering the whole enterprise? And where can we build jobs here in New England and in Massachusetts? I used to be in the Navy, and so I sometimes show these images. What we're really talking about is essentially building a chart, a guide, something we can reference on our journey. So as we get the ship underway, there's a lot of things that can happen, but today we know we're not going into an ocean filled with sea monsters and mermaids and swirling vortices that are going to sink our ship. We have enough information to know that we can start out safely, even though we very well may have to change course along the way. We have a reference to do that. And in the middle of the screen is a snapshot. The European Union did this about 8 years ago, and you can see how they characterize their roadmap, a practical guide to prospering and achieving the low carbon goal. So that's really what the roadmap is intended to do. And we think we need a roadmap right now for a number of reasons. Political, and those really echo what I said before, to re-energize regional cooperation, to show people Massachusetts is a leader. We always have been, we always will be, I hope. But we need the data. We need to be able to convince our neighbors that we can do this together. you can see also, I think it's really important, and we'll talk a little bit more, why it's important that we maintain public support in this next phase. Really, we're shifting from pointing our fingers at large energy companies and telling them to shut down their coal plants and do something different. And we'll be pointing our fingers sort of at ourselves and our neighbors and talking about things like how we get to work and how we heat our homes. And there's a sort of a more personal aspect. On the technical side, the low-hanging fruit is gone. We don't have any more coal plants to shut down, which is fantastic news. But now we have to really transform, and we're not just doing less of a bad thing, we have to start doing new things. And we really don't have a template for how to do that other than looking to our neighbors in California or in the EU. This is, as you can see, really challenging work. It's cross-sector. I mean, what I mean by that is we have to be lowering emissions in the transportation sector while we lower them in the electricity sector. And so now we have to start thinking. Normally right now there's people who think about transportation and they never think about electricity, and vice versa. Now those teams have to come together to figure out a multi-sector problem. And we have to achieve year on year for 32 years. So it's a big challenge. We really can't take time off. And as you can see, we want to signal the market, and that's another thing that a roadmap would do. And I'll talk a little bit about offshore wind. That's a great guide for what this looks like. And we just had a big announcement here yesterday, which I could talk about, but we are moving definitively into a clean energy market, and that's going to bring jobs to places like New Bedford and Fall River and all across the South Coast. So a quick pause. One question it's fair to ask is, why do we need to do this? Aren't we doing enough now? There's certainly a lot of activity going on at DEP. I work with some really good people there all the time. So I know that they're working hard. But it's really, and you can see my examples at the bottom of the slide, conceptually, it's a shift. So right now we've been really short term. We've been in the political cycle, if you will, or in one governor's administrative tenure, and only working to the outer bounds of that short term period, aiming for 2020 instead of aiming for 2050. What's the difference? When you're aiming for 2050, you tend to do things that are non-transformative. You try and tweak something but keep everything else the same, and you really miss an opportunity to transform and jump ahead. And a great example is offshore wind. The most expensive way to buy offshore wind, we tried it once. It was Cape Wind. It was a 400 megawatt project, and the prices were very high. What we discovered is it's like shopping at Costco. If you know you're going to use it, and that's where the planning comes in. You don't want to overbuy, but if you know the holidays are coming, you can go ahead and buy in bulk and get a lower per unit cost. But we need information to do that. And just yesterday, the state announced that they understand that they're going to buy 800 megawatts at a time, and we're expecting very, very low prices. So again, it's this near term, long term. If you're stuck in the near term running the 100-yard dash, you'll be out of juice when you get to the, you're trying to get into Copley from Heartbreak Hill. If you haven't been planning for the end of the race, then you'll probably be out of breath. So we need to shift from short-term planning to at least some long-term structural planning to work with. What is a roadmap? A roadmap is, again, it's this multi-sector analysis of different ways to get to 2050. And this is just some graphics. There was a roadmap done for the United States, not by the US government, but that's where this data comes from. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner, it's showing sources of electricity: wind, solar, nuclear, fossil. And you can see year after year, the fossil generation is getting smaller. There still is some in 2050 in this one model. That's not out of the question, but you can see the pace and scale of reductions there and the pace and scale of increase, for example, in wind or solar. And so it's really charting that out, not just in the electricity sector, but in the middle column, our buildings and our industrial. How are we heating our buildings? And on the right side, there's a lot on here, but we're also would be looking at industrial process heat. So how is Gillette going to run its factory? We want that factory. We want those jobs. But we may need to change the way they heat and build their product. So we're looking for multiple pathways, a guideline. And again, going back to my SHIP reference, right now we do have a greenhouse gas inventory. That's the GHG inventory. That essentially tells you where you are. It gives you a snapshot of how much your emissions are. But without the chart, you don't really know where you're going, right? At any one moment, you know where you are, you know you've gone up or you've gone down or you've stayed the same. But without a broader picture, without that roadmap, we don't really know how to assess whether we're really on the track we need to be to get to 2050. There's a lot of, this is people far smarter than me and far better than numbers would do this analysis. And you can find out things that I know people are talking about, and they rightly should be. How can we do this with more renewables? Well, luckily we have really smart analysts and computers that can model this in the winter, in the spring, in the summer, the fall, day by day, hour by hour, not predicting the future, but doing our best to model and work the issue. How would we do it with a lot of solar? You can see the yellow in the middle of the day in the spring or the summer. And then are we balancing that with generating low carbon gas from excess electricity? Are we balancing it with battery storage? There's lots of different ways to do it. Another thing a roadmap gets you because of this detail is it lets you start talking about cost, which is really crucial, I think. And one thing, so when you track cost across all of the energy sources, you start to see interesting things, like the bottom of this graph shows savings, right? So instead of all of us going to the gas station once or twice a week and paying a certain amount of money for gasoline, we're not going to have those costs. So that's a savings. We may pay a little bit more for an electric vehicle, or we'll have to pay electricity costs to charge it, but there might be a plus, there might be a minus. And so if we really track and think about it systematically, this is really a system engineering approach, you can start to come up with really valuable cost data. Again, cost is uncertain. They're not trying to predict the market, but you can start to see things like how it might impact you or me, a household budget. And here you can see predicted spending less per month on gasoline and maybe having a higher initial vehicle cost with electricity cost. There's a net difference there. Same thing with house. We're no longer buying gas or oil. I hope not too many of you are still on oil just because it's expensive in the winter, but that cost would disappear, and you would maybe have a slightly higher electricity cost. And you can see this is a prediction that it would roughly be a net increase in cost of about $36 a month per household. Nothing. So this isn't a costless revolution that we can maybe do for free, but it also is not something that is necessarily prohibitively expensive at those levels. So what would this bill do? This bill is really trying to get that kind of level of analysis, and again, multiple pathways. So we don't want to pick, at this point, pick one specific pathway. We want to create opportunities and see multiple pathways that, again, would allow for, as well, new technologies that come to develop, that are developed in the next 30 years. But we do this, this is called backcasting analysis, where you go to 2050 and build back from where you need to be instead of starting where you are and sort of being confused about how you could possibly get to the end. And we would do this over the next 2 years, then set 2 limits that are already required by law, but there's no time limit or framework in the law for how or when they're set. So that's setting our Global Warming Solutions Act limits for 2030 and 2040. And that's consistent. We figure the roadmap out, and then we put those markers down, and we've now signaled to investment, we've signaled to business where Massachusetts is going, at least the framework of it. And then the bill would require a new set of regulations, comprehensive, all emissions, all sectors. So we've been focused on electric power now for 10 years, and that was good. It was good what we did. We should shut down the coal plants, and we have. But again, now we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can't take another 10 or 15 years just talking about transportation, and then sometime in 2030 or 2040, start talking about buildings. If we do that, it's too late. So we have to be able to do things simultaneously. And that's what this new set of regulations would be addressing. How do we get to 2050? Not how do we get to 2030 or 2035, but let's come up with a plan that we think can get us all the way there. At the bottom, slightly controversial, but we think it's absolutely necessary, and this is modeled on a fee that's collected successfully for the last 10 years, actually 12 years in California, never challenged in court in California, and that's a simple administrative fee. There are about 290 large emitters, or carbon polluters, if you will, in Massachusetts. They're already regulated, and this would bring money in to specifically fund implementation work. So it would fund positions at DEP and in the governor's office and in the Department of Transportation, specific people hired to work on this problem, which we think is absolutely necessary. This, again, I have more questions than I have answers on how we get there. This is tough stuff we need to figure out. There's a little bit more that this bill could do, so we think there's an opportunity here. The Senate version updates the reporting requirements for all the agencies from what they were in 2008 in the original Global Warming Solutions Act, assuming that we create a real 2050 plan, as we are hoping the state will, then we would just adjust the reporting requirements accordingly. The Senate version of this bill has a carbon pricing piece in it, and I know that's a high priority for the league, and appreciate that very much. I think it could go either way. As the Senate version requires some carbon pricing, the original House version authorized it, expressly authorized it. So I think the legislature has something they can debate there and compromise whether they want carbon pricing mandated, or they use this bill to say, when we do that comprehensive rulemaking, put carbon pricing in place if the analysis supports it. The Senate version also clarifies that the Global Warming Solutions Act applies to everybody in Massachusetts, and that's really a response to some of the municipal light plants who have, I think, as a result of some bad lawyering, have asserted that they are independent, that no one can regulate them, and that they can emit whatever they want. And I don't think the people in those towns believe that, but the managers of the plants have been protecting their jobs a little bit there. The last one is really one of the most important here that the bill has a potential to do, and we think this is resonating in the House a little bit, and that's to integrate protections for real people into the Global Warming Solutions Act. So one of the things we've been learning at CLF as we've looking ahead to this next phase, we were very involved in shutting down coal plants and bringing offshore wind, and I call that phase one. It was really focused on the electric power sector, big infrastructure, like I said, on energy companies. And phase two, though, this is a sort of a stunning percentage in my mind. On the pie chart on the left is from the state of Massachusetts. That's from the Department of Environmental Protection that tracks the emissions, showing our emissions for 2014, which is one of the latest, most recent full sets of data we have. There's some time lag before we get the full numbers. And you can see in purple, the emissions related to the electric power sector are much lower than they used to be. 20% of our emissions, historically they were 35%. So they've come down. And you can also see a lot of people are talking about that 39.4% for transportation in the sort of teal blue. But if another way to think about it is, who is residential, who does that fall on? And really, we've got 60% between the residential space heating and emissions related to our stoves and water heaters and furnaces. Between that and transportation, about 60% of our remaining reductions are coming from you and me. They're coming from households. And that's why we think it's really important. I'm not sure people realize that. I'm not sure CLF knew this in a way as tangibly as we do now 10 years ago. So again, things have changed. We're at a different place, and we think this would be a real smart time for Massachusetts to make it clear that we're doing this all together, right? That we know that people might have to buy a new car, that they might need to insulate their house, and maybe somebody needs to go first and buy a heat pump when it's a little bit more expensive. How are we going to do that together? Are those going to be rebates? Are they going to be incentives? Are we going to ask the utilities to step in like they do with energy efficiency now and just knock on our door and say, hey, do you want a free air conditioner? You know, maybe that works. I don't know. But this is really focused on people. So this next phase. So we think this would be an important thing to add, if you will, to the Global Warming Solutions Act. And I'm almost done. I'll leave. I won't spend much time on this. This just shows the two bills as they were filed. As I said, there's more in the Senate bill. And that's really where the bill exists right now. The original filing in the House was sort of the core content that CLF had originally proposed. I know this is being recorded, and you can probably ask Karen and Lana for a copy of this. So this is really in the slide deck for later use if you want to reference it with a representative or a senator. And I think that's all I have. So I can pause and answer questions, and certainly go back to any slides that folks are interested in talking about.
Great. Thank you, David. We have already gotten some questions, but for everybody else, it's time to ask questions. To ask a question orally, raise your hand and wait to be called on. If you should get a message about unmuting. After you ask your question, I will remute you. To ask a written question, which is more common, and then I'll read it, type it into the chat box and hit return. It will go only to us, not everyone. Written questions will be answered orally, and we will answer as many as we can. So the first question came in quite early, and that was from Colleen asking, is New Jersey back on board with the new governor in office?
It looks like they are, which is fantastic. Okay. So I don't think they have actually re-entered RGGI technically yet, but the governor has directed the state to re-enter, I believe, so that that is happening, which is fantastic.
Okay. The next question is from Laura. This was back on your slide with the analysis of, I think, with the house and the car.
Sure.
I think she's asking, does this analysis include or not include capital costs of a shift, electric car, for example, or monthly costs after a shift has occurred, such as the purchase of electric vehicle or air source heat pump, for example?
Yes. So I would have to double check sort of the total extent of the costs that are included, but you can see on the vehicle, there's a vehicle cost bar and an electricity cost. So these are, if I remember correctly, these are average household costs for the US in about 2040 in this one study. So again, just one analysis. We would have our own associated with our own roadmap analysis that was specific to us, but those vehicle costs are assuming a monthly cost for essentially an electric vehicle or a zero emission vehicle, as well as the fuel cost, which is now electricity, so showing the savings of not having to buy gasoline. And then the same with the household. I don't know. I know that their model was all electric, so I'm not sure whether they included sort of the capital costs of a new oven, range, water heater, and heat pump, or whether they were estimating it by using the largest of those purchases, which I think is generally the heat pump. But that's an interesting one too. If there's a double savings, if you will. You replace two boxes in your basement, your furnace and your air conditioner. You lose the joy of paying for gas or oil in the winter, and then you've got a different electricity cost. And again, that's showing about a $60 a month prorated or time-based equipment cost for the new equipment.
Okay, we have a hand up from Alan, and So Alan, it says actually you're using an older version of Zoom, and so you can't speak. Sorry.
Yeah.
So just type it into the chat box. Next question from Colleen again. Where are the bills now? What is the likelihood of this being passed this session? Always a good question.
An excellent question. An excellent question.
Crystal ball question.
Yeah, and so I'll actually use two. The number, I went back to the first slide just to show the number. The House version was 2149, filed by Representative Smizik. What happened procedurally, I'm not sure why, the House, the TUE committee chair is Representative Golden. Because there was a mirror image in the Senate, he made the choice to join the two bills, and so there technically is no House bill still in the House, and it is only active procedurally as Section 67 of this Senate Bill 2302. So how does it happen in the House? How would it happen now? What we've been talking to members of the House about is there are two potential steps. One is for the House to amend this language to another bill that is active, and then take that into conference committee. So what now will happen is at some point, House and Senate leadership will confer and designate a committee to figure out all this energy stuff, right? They've got two different packages, one in the Senate, one in the House. There's some overlap, and they go into conference committee where essentially anything can be drafted or redrafted. So because it's alive in the Senate, it will be there in the conference committee. And if it's something that House and Senate leadership agree on, it will end up in the final bill. So it's, at this point, I mean, probably the most important takeaway is we've been talking to members of the House, and the Senate already understands it. It's in the Senate bill as a result of Senator Pacheco's leadership, really. And now we've been really talking to House members and making sure they know about it, understand the value, looking ahead to that bargaining, that final bargain.
Okay, Alan, who had tried to do the oral question, has written a very similar question. Just you could tell us if you think you've covered it.
Sure.
Given that the Senate omnibus bill appears to be DOA in the House, what is the roadmap for getting this bill passed by the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what I just described. I mean, I think the thought, and I've heard members of the House, including some in House leadership, say sort of, we're not going to pass the whole omnibus bill. And I said, well, that's not a surprise. It's asking for a lot. But we've seen this in the past few sessions where there's essentially, being a lawyer, I think of it as a negotiation. There's an offer, and there's a counteroffer, and then there's a compromise. And so the Senate omnibus bill is the Senate's offer. It's very ambitious. It's signaling that the Senate wants to do a lot. They want to make a big statement. They want to really address climate. The House countered with a much smaller proposal, and so now it's what do they do between the two? I don't think it's a question of the entire omnibus passing as written by the Senate. It's what pieces of that overlap with things that the House is willing to move on and they think the governor will sign. So it's really more addressing pieces, and this is one piece we think can survive with enough support.
Okay, a couple people have asked about the slides/presentation being made available. We will have the slides available on the LWVMA website and the presentation video of the presentation.
Great.
If all goes well. Okay, Eileen, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I would. David, thank you for this thoughtful presentation. I would like to ask a question that applies to munis. we live in the town of Norwood, and our league is doing a local study on conservation and energy and so forth and so on. So we've been in close contact several times with both the manager of our light department and the members of our light department, which are also our selectmen.
Yeah.
So, so we know that they're not particularly happy about joining in with everyone, and they do like to stay separate. But after thoughtful investigation and conversation, it appears that they are truly doing a very good job at buying renewable energy, and they aren't reselling RECs and so forth and so on. So
Right.
yeah, it took us a long time to figure out what all those things were.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
But anyway, it's very complicated. And but anyways, they do appear to be doing a great job. So what would you say to a municipal light company that's doing a good job but still doesn't want to join?
Oh, that still doesn't want to join. Well, I would say that that we're all in it together, and that what it means to join or to be subject to the Global Warming Solutions Act is really to be on a pathway to 2050. And there are different pathways, but none of them, for example, well, there's some things that no one can do and still be on track for 2050. Burning more fossil fuels is one. You know, if a muni decided to purchase a large biomass plant and then the fuel wasn't carbon neutral, that would be like building a coal plant. And so, you know, and some of the munis are big enough, and they are big enough as a group. So it's about 15% of all the electricity in the state now is delivered by munis, that if they aren't part of it, the rest of us can't achieve the goal. I mean, it's just that simple. You know, you could reduce 80% to zero, and if you had 15% that was still off doing its own thing, the Commonwealth fails.
How can I convince them that they think they're on the right path and they do look like they're doing a good job? What am I supposed to say to them?
That they shouldn't be afraid to join the group. And I mean, what it means is not, there's a lot of concern that this would remove local control. Essentially, let me see if I can do this. You know, the Global Warming Solutions Act says we're all on a path like this to lower emissions. It doesn't say much about how we get there underneath. And so all being subject to the GWSA means is that you're on this glide slope to low carbon. And when the DEP was recently considering subjecting the MLPs to a clean energy standard, which is like the renewable portfolio standard, but a little bit broader, different definitions, they were completely open to having each MLP have its own sort of on-ramp. You know, there's different ownership, there's different mixes of resources that they have long-term contracts on. But somewhere around 2035, we all have to be about at the same level. And that's enough time. You know, 15 years is enough time for most of the contracts to run out. And the other thing is, I would love the help of MLPs. And I just met the new manager of the MLP in Marblehead last night. And he's really enthusiastic because they're also doing well. So he's said, you know, we have no reason to hold out. And we understand that other munis aren't doing anything. And I'm not going to point fingers. I mean, some are small, some have, you know, not as a different economic base. But there's ways for the munis to work together as well and combine their purchasing power. They could be bidding into the offshore wind right now. I mean, Vineyard Wind, I'm sure, would give them a really great deal on 10 more turbines. I mean, they're already going to buy 100 for the state. And, you know, again, when you buy at scale, you can add a couple more on for a pretty low price.
Okay, great. A simple question, can you reiterate the name of the EU guide?
Oh, sure. It's called Roadmap 2050.
Okay.
And it's available online. This is a snapshot. I mean, they've gone, really this roadmap analysis is just the initial quantitative data. It's the analysis that says, hey, how much, for us, it's probably a question of how much offshore wind do we want, how much onshore wind do we want, how much hydropower from Quebec do we want, how much rooftop solar do we want. I don't think New Englanders want to build a number of new nuclear plants, but if they do, that can be studied to see how much it would cost. But once you do that first, then you still have to figure out policies to get you there. But without the roadmap, sort of if you don't know how many electric vehicles you need on the road in 10 years, it's really hard to decide or to create an effective policy to get there. So you have to know, where you're going. But EU, if you Google EU Roadmap 2050, you can find the report and a number of others.
Okay, a question from Sharon. I was surprised at the small slice of emissions attributed to agriculture. My understanding is that food production is about 40% of emissions.
It's a really regional thing. It varies state by state, which is one of the, and really region by region. So I don't doubt that in some places it might be. I think we're showing here 0.3%, if I'm picking the right color, of our emissions. It's mainly from dairy cows in Massachusetts, but we don't really have a lot of the types of large-scale agriculture that the Midwest and California have, that can be very emissions intensive. So and those numbers may vary as closely as Vermont. They more dairy cows there than we have in Massachusetts. I'm guessing. I don't know, but I think it really varies. And it's another reason for this kind of analysis is it's not enough. It isn't good enough information to know that you have to cut or know that you want renewables. You have to at some point look and say, what do we really have here? What does it look like in Massachusetts? How much big industry do we have? This is a different picture in parts of the country that in the South where a lot of cars are assembled. There's big factories there. We don't have too many of those here. So it depends.
Okay. Sally asked, do you have a percent breakdown of what the different transportation emissions consist of? For example, percent consumer cars, percent trucking, et cetera.
Not that I can give you right now, but they are laid out in the official greenhouse gas inventory or greenhouse gas emission inventory that these numbers come from. They're maintained by the Department of Environmental Protection. And I would actually be happy. I've got it. I can send it easily to Karen or Lana. And it's a big spreadsheet, and there's a tab called mobile emissions, and that's all our transportation emissions, including ones people don't think of: boats, aircraft, heavy rail, heavy trucks, and it's all broken out. I believe that roadway, one way to slice it is that in Massachusetts, and again, it varies place to place, roadway emissions are about 75 or 80% of our emissions. So that's both heavy, medium, and light trucking. But the majority of that, a huge portion of that, are passenger vehicles.
Okay. We actually have 3 questions that are related. People still a little confused about the bills, the status, and what they can do. So the first one is, who would develop the roadmap and who would approve it?
Good question. The roadmap, the way the Secretary of the Energy Environmental Agency, who oversees all the Department of Environmental Protection and a number of other environmental agencies, is overall in charge in the Global Warming Solutions Act already. And this would happen under the Secretary's direction right now, with together, as most things are, about emissions with the Department of Environmental Protection. So that's essentially our state EPA. They're the ones that already regulate emissions and always have for health and safety reasons. So this would be a similar to analysis that's going on right now, that's being done by our state agencies, would be approved by the heads of those agencies. It's just a different kind of analysis. The bill would also, the one thing we did want to ensure is that the analysis and the model underlying it would be made public. So one of the things that happens now that's not very helpful is when people do analysis and they run a model, and then all they do is they show you the slides at the end, and people will have a million questions. But what did you assume for X? How did you treat electric vehicles? What's the rate of emissions, that you used, and how did you change it each year? And to build the kind of consensus we need, that all has to be public. So this would be done by public agencies, but right now, not all the analysis that they've done, actually most of it, all we get to see is the results, and that doesn't really help build consensus. So that's one. It would still be executed at the direction of the agencies, but this bill would ensure that all that underlying data is public.
Okay, so there's a question about, did the bill pass out of committee already and get a vote? What are the prospects for attaching the roadmap language to another bill? If so, what bill? And what should climate activists do to enhance the prospects for this bill? So speak about
Sure. Yeah. So again, the Senate version was approved by the committee, the Global Warming and Climate Change Committee of the Senate. It is in the omnibus, and we expect that to pass a unanimous Senate. So that side is pretty good. On the House side, there is no active bill. So as I said, it got transferred out of the House to the Senate. It's a procedural detail, essentially. And what has to happen now is enough House members have to say, we want that thing. We want a plan. We want the clean energy roadmap. And again, House leadership can make any amendment it wants to its own bills. So it could happen tomorrow if Speaker DeLeo wanted to amend it to attach it to a bill that is procedurally active, or it could happen again at the conference committee, which will likely happen in mid-July before an end of July session. So I think that the main thing an activist can do now is to get in touch with his or her House representative and say, we think the House needs to do more than what it did, which was to propose a slight raise in RPS, a very small rise in the solar net metering caps. So they're maintaining a cap and moving it up just a little bit. And that's about all they've proposed so far. So there's about 20 things or 25 things in the Senate bill and 4 in the House bill. And so I think the message is that's not enough. We really need to do more, and we want a plan. Right. And I think there's almost an image here of the House proposing 25 things and the Senate proposing a lot and the House proposing a little. It kind of shows a disconnect. Like, we don't have a plan. We're not all on the same page. And so I think what's most valuable is to reach out to your representative, to urge them to support this bill, to support the concept, to talk to House leadership. And the more House leadership hears, the people that vote for us want us to do more. And I keep hearing about this thing that people want to do, and it's sitting right there in the Senate bill. So we can just agree to do that.
Okay. Oral question from Ruth. Ruth, you want to ask your question?
Hi, Ruth.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So this question is a little bit off from what you are talking about, and you may or may not be able to answer it. Some of us are tasked with coming up with a carbon offset policy for the town. And so this is prior to achieving any kind of net zero and any kind of, so it's just carbon offsets. And I am floating the idea in the town of using money as a proxy for carbon dioxide offsets. And my question is, if I explain a little bit of what I'm talking about, whether you would be in a position and care to venture an opinion about whether this is worth pursuing and considering or not. And by that, what I'm proposing is somewhere between 0.05% and 1% of municipal pieces to be put in a carbon offset fund. And those pieces are everything from new construction, municipal renovations, and all energy bills. So everything from buses, lights, the running of all of the buildings.
Mhm.
And those bills are easily accessed. And taking that percentage, put in a fund, and putting it to anything from RECs to EV chargers, solar panels, et cetera, on buildings. And the question, of course, arises, we would be more than offsetting some items and less than offsetting other items. But if we choose a reasonable number, would it be a way of avoiding large costs and like the alternative that I see is trying to drill down on every single piece of carbon emission in a town, capturing it and hiring someone to do that and to implement some kind of an offset policy. So I'm trying to save money in the town by proposing that we use money as a proxy for carbon dioxide emissions.
Yeah, and I would love to talk to you more about it. I mean, it could, normally the way people talk about the term offset is that you really are, as you probably know, picking something that will reduce emissions somewhere by the same amount as they're being emitted locally. So, the offset can be local. Very often the idea is that it's easier for somebody somewhere else to not emit or to absorb a ton of carbon instead of doing it locally. So, and then it sounds also, it's a little bit of a green energy fund, if you will, which is really good. I think it just maybe gets tricky on how the town represents itself. If it's saying, we have X emissions and we think we're now at X minus 10, and if the reason is because of an offset, then normally people want to know that offset had a direct reduction somewhere else. So it may be a good idea. I'd be happy to sort of think it through more with you. It sounds really creative.
I would love that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I disabled the talking. Yeah, Ruth, we could put you in contact with David.
Yeah.
We have time for just a few. We have 5 minutes left, and we have probably 5 minutes worth of questions here.
Great.
What are the greatest obstacles to passage of the roadmap?
Sure. I think it's probably there's maybe two on the Senate side. There's a lot of stuff in that bill, and I don't pretend to say that just because it's what we think is important, that a majority of senators, if they had to pick one more thing, that is the thing they would pick. I mean, some people may rightly be very invested, say, in community solar and low-income solar. That is not in the House proposal. It is in the Senate proposal. So there's a lot of competing concepts out there. And then on the House side, I think we're building momentum and visibility. Like I said, CLF has presented this directly to the number 2 person in the House, Representative Haddad. We're in the process of getting a meeting with the chairman of the Telecom Utility and Energy Committee, Representative Golden. I would love to sit down with Speaker DeLeo. I haven't had that chance yet. So the biggest obstacle is if the legislators don't hear from us that this is something we think is important, then it'll get lost in, among a lot of other priorities. But conversely, I think the way to get it passed is to use the next 2 months, which is really when all the deals are happening. I mean, this is when the budgets are almost done, and that this is the time in the session when legislators are trying to figure out what the final set of bills is going to be.
Okay. On a similar note, my representative tells me that there is no bill to vote on in the House, so she has no pathway to support the omnibus bill in particular, since it's a Senate bill. Please explain.
Sure. Again, there's only about 4 bills that have survived the TUE committee in the House, and they're so your representative is right. She can't throw a vote right now in favor of this because she's not in the Senate, and it's not in the House. But again, that's I think that's sort of missing the forest for the trees, which is to say that we've got representatives meeting with House leadership all the time, and our supporters are, when they meet with Speaker DeLeo, they say, "Hey, those 4 bills aren't enough. You need to add this one. You need to do this," and that's really what's gonna move it. Is the votes only come at the end, so nobody really does anything in a way by voting. I don't mean to disrupt our model of civics. The votes happen at the end, but all the hard work of legislating are the personal relationships and hearing from legislators or constituents, and when the reps talk to each other and say, "Man, I keep getting calls about this clean energy roadmap, and I get it. It sounds really important." It's changing their minds so that when they're in caucus and when the House leadership is deciding what it's going to do, that this is one of the things they're considering.
Okay. This might be the last question, and I'm sorry, there's one hand raised and a couple questions still remaining. Do you view the roadmap as a vehicle for some sort of regional compact as a way to amplify the impact of states?
I do, and that's one of the reasons. I'll just flip back here. One of the political reasons that we think we need a roadmap is that really Massachusetts is in a position where we can do a lot, and we may be able to meet our own goals by moving on our own. But we're starting to see, we can see the value, and offshore wind again is an area here. If we're moving with Connecticut and with Rhode Island together, it would be great if we can maybe after the next election move together again with Maine. But if we can move as a region, we have better buying power. I mean, it's sort of what we've done in New England traditionally, is work together. And right now, like I said, since 2010, that relationship has been strained. It's been fractured. There's really turned into a north-south divide where you have Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine saying, we don't want to do anything that'll help Connecticut or Massachusetts. Why? I don't know, because we're not those states. And that's new. We didn't used to talk like that in New England. And so we think this is one way that a Massachusetts law can re-energize that regional conversation, because there's no credible way to do this kind of analysis pretending that Massachusetts is on its own. We're part of a regional electricity grid. We're part of an interstate gas pipeline system. We daily import and export electricity with New York, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. And so when experts look at this, they actually tend to start modeling somewhere around New Jersey and end in New Brunswick, because that's really this mega region that moves together. And so if Massachusetts can do this road mapping regionally to figure out its own part of that, we think it'll be using its leadership position to show other states, hey, we can do this together.
Okay, I think we've reached our time, and Lana's gonna finish up. Lana?
Great.
Well, David, thank you very, very much for the presentation. A lot of information. It's actually exciting to be thinking ahead and planning for something, as opposed to all the incremental bits and pieces that I think is the more traditional approach. I just want to reiterate what you said with regard to action to help move this bill through the session, this session, and that is to focus on the House, to let the House know that we think they need to do more, and that let the House know that we think there needs to be a plan. Not that we think there needs to be a plan, there needs to be a plan so that we can be proactive and find what is most economical and technologically feasible. So those are the marching orders for people who would like to see this bill pass. So thank you again, David, for a great presentation. And thank you to all the participants for tuning in and for your great questions. And we look forward to seeing you perhaps or having you join us in the fall.
Great. Thank you.
You're resuming the webinar program.
Yeah, and thank you, Lana and Karen in particular, and to the League for your support of this bill. And I completely agree. I mean, I put up, the list of those supporters that we currently know about this, have signed on, are actively supporting. We briefed the House staffers last week, and another 11 representatives who are not on this list sent their staffers. So we're quickly expanding, who's participating, and so thank you, and thank you to the League and all the folks on the webinar for all your hard work. We can sort of come up with the ideas, but and talk inside the building, but it's really you talking to your representatives that gets things passed.
Constituents matter. So
Absolutely. Yep.
thanks again, everyone, and see you next time.